The town of Coldwater, 1978. A place where cornfields stretched endlessly, where nights fell quiet enough that a single barking dog carried across miles. Yet beneath the stillness, tension lingered, a tension tied to the man who wore the badge of authority. Police Chief Harold Whitmore. Harold was respected. Yes, but respect in Coldwater often came wrapped in fear. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that filled every room. People said he carried his authority like a weapon, that his eyes could silence an argument before his voice ever did. He ruled the streets with order, but order was built on intimidation. That night, December 3, 1978, Harold left the station long after most had gone home. The lights in his office had burned late, casting his shadow across the frosted glass. He carried no case files, no partners, just his leather coat draped over his arm, his revolver holstered at his side. He told his deputy he had unfinished business, but did not explain. "Chief, you sure you don't need backup?" Raymond, his loyal deputy, lingered by the door, his voice uneasy. Harold glanced at him, expression flat. "I said I'll handle it. Go home, Ray. You've got a family." That was the last time anyone inside the department saw Harold Whitmore alive. Outside, the air was bitter, laced with the sharp bite of winter. Streetlights hummed against the dark, their glow barely cutting through the fog rolling in from the fields. Harold walked to his black and white patrol car, boots crunching on the gravel. He slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove into the night. No one knew where he was headed. Descriptions later painted the image of his final drive, headlights carving narrow paths down deserted country roads, his silhouette rigid behind the wheel. He didn't stop at the diner where he was known to drink coffee at midnight. He didn't head toward home. Instead, his car vanished into the darkness, swallowed whole as if Coldwater itself had decided to erase him. By dawn, Margaret Whitmore woke to an empty bed. The other side of the mattress was cold, the sheets undisturbed. At first, she told herself it was routine. Harold often worked late, sometimes all night. But when the clock pushed past 9 a.m., unease turned into dread. She called the station. "It's Margaret." Harold didn't come home. "Where is he?" The pause on the other end said more than words. Deputy Raymond cleared his throat. "Ma'am, he left last night. Said he had business. We assumed." His voice trailed off. Assumptions weren't good enough. Margaret reported him missing by noon. The chief of police gone missing without a trace. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Whispers began immediately. In a town as small as Coldwater, silence never lasted long. Some said Harold had enemies, that his grip on power had pushed too many men into corners. Others claimed they'd seen him with a woman who wasn't his wife, a woman in red, always waiting in the shadows near the old motel off Highway 16. But there was something else, something darker, quiet talk among the officers themselves. Corruption, bribes, and dirty deals were hidden beneath Harold's polished authority. To some, his disappearance wasn't a mystery. It was retribution. The town was split. Did Harold run from his sins? Or was he buried by them? Days turned to weeks and the investigation hit dead ends. No car, nobody, no trace. Just a growing absence that weighed heavier with each passing night. Margaret held on to hope, but even she began to sense what others feared to say out loud. Harold Whitmore was never coming back. The case froze in silence, but silence is never empty. It hums, it whispers, and in that void, the first cracks in Coldwater's facade began to spread. Because when a man like Harold vanishes, he doesn't vanish alone. He takes with him secrets, debts, and desires that others would kill to keep buried. And as the town tried to settle back into routine, those secrets began to stir. Echoes of betrayal, of forbidden love, of corruption too heavy to stay hidden. The vanishing point was only the beginning. Coldwater in the weeks after Harold Whitmore's disappearance felt less like a town and more like a body without a heartbeat. The chief's office sat locked, blinds drawn, his desk untouched, a shrine to a man no one could agree on. Some called him a protector, others whispered the word tyrant. Without him, the streets seemed quieter, but the silence was sharp, unsettling like the calm before a storm. Rumors filled that silence. Coffee shops and bar counters became courts of speculation. The butcher swore Harold had been seen arguing with a stranger outside town the week before. A waitress claimed she'd overheard him at the diner, voice low, speaking to someone about leaving it all behind. And then there was the rumor no one wanted to say too loudly, that Harold wasn't just missing. He had run. Margaret Whitmore refused to believe it. Her face, pale and drawn, became a fixture at the station. She demanded updates that never came, tore through Harold's papers at home, and pressed officers with questions they couldn't answer. One night, exhausted, she confronted Deputy Raymond. "You knew him better than anyone. Don't lie to me, Ray. Did he say something? Did he leave me?" Raymond hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he folded them on the desk. "Ma'am," he was under pressure, "but no. He didn't run from you. Harold wasn't the kind of man to walk away." His words were steady, but his eyes betrayed doubt. Across town, the whispers took a darker turn. Evelyn Marsh's name surfaced. The woman in red often spotted near the highway motel. She was younger, alluring, and lived alone on the edge of Coldwater. Some swore Harold's car had been seen parked outside her place. Others whispered she was the reason for his silence. The town judged quickly, but Evelyn herself stayed hidden, blinds drawn, lips sealed. For now, she was only a shadow in the narrative, a mystery yet to step into the light. Meanwhile, the department struggled to function. Officers argued over leadership, their loyalty fractured. Without Harold's commanding presence, old grudges surfaced. Files went missing, calls went unanswered, and small crimes slipped through the cracks. The force, once united under fear, began to unravel. "This isn't what he built," Raymond muttered one evening, slamming a drawer shut. "Or maybe," another officer whispered back, "this is exactly what he built." The emotional toll deepened. Margaret drifted through her home like a ghost, haunted by the cold side of her bed. She replayed their last conversation endlessly. Harold telling her he'd be late. The lack of warmth in his tone. The way his eyes lingered on something unsaid. Cinematically, her nights were marked by dim lamplight, a half-empty glass of wine trembling in her hand, and the sound of the clock echoing through the hollow house. She waited for footsteps at the door that never came. In the absence of answers, the town turned on itself. Every secret, every betrayal became a possible piece of the puzzle. Harold's disappearance was no longer just a mystery. It was a mirror, reflecting the lies and fractures of Coldwater itself. The longer he remained gone, the more his shadow grew, stretching into every corner of the community. Friendships cracked under suspicion. Lovers whispered fears in the dark. And the chief's legacy became less about what he had done, and more about what he might have been hiding. By the second month, the town's patience wore thin. The chief of police had vanished, leaving only echoes in his wake. Echoes of doubt, of betrayal, of forbidden love. And in those echoes, one name began to repeat with growing certainty: Evelyn Marsh. For weeks, Evelyn Marsh had been little more than a whisper, a name carried in hushed tones, an outline in other people's stories. But in February 1979, the whispers became impossible to ignore. Her house, a modest single story at the edge of town, seemed to absorb the stares of Coldwater. Curtains drawn day and night, mailbox overflowing, a single red coat often glimpsed hanging by her front door. The town branded her the woman in red, though few could say why. Some swore she always wore it when meeting Harold. Others claimed it was the last thing she was seen in, standing beneath a flickering motel sign as snow fell around her. Whether truth or myth, the image stuck, a figure draped in crimson tied to the chief's vanishing like blood to a wound. Evelyn was 28, striking in a way that unsettled people. Dark hair, pale skin, lips painted bold even on quiet days. She had moved to Coldwater only a few years earlier, working part-time at the diner before quitting suddenly. Since then, she lived quietly, supported by means no one could trace. Detectives finally knocked on her door. "Miss Marsh?" Deputy Raymond asked, his breath fogging in the cold. "We'd like to ask a few questions about Harold Whitmore." There was a pause before the door creaked open. Evelyn appeared, robe cinched at the waist, eyes sharp despite the hour. "I've already said everything I know," she replied coolly. "Then you won't mind repeating it." Her official statement was simple. She barely knew Harold, only saw him occasionally at the diner, and had no idea where he'd gone. But her tone betrayed more than her words. Behind every denial was hesitation, and behind every hesitation the suggestion of memory. Later, Margaret heard of Evelyn's name appearing in the reports. The thought of another woman in Harold's orbit ignited a rage she struggled to contain. In private, she smashed a vase against the kitchen wall, shards scattering across the floor. 40 years of my life, she whispered bitterly, and he still wasn't mine. The truth of Evelyn's involvement seeped slowly through fragments. A neighbor recalled seeing Harold's car parked outside her home late at night. A motel clerk remembered the chief signing a guest book with a false name, always accompanied by a woman who matched Evelyn's description. And then there was the waitress, the same one who had overheard Harold whisper about leaving it all behind. She swore Evelyn was the woman sitting across from him that night, her red nails tapping impatiently on the formica table. Evelyn herself, when alone, wrestled with her silence. Nights found her pacing in that dim house, ashtrays filling with cigarettes, the red coat draped over a chair like a ghost of choices made. She remembered Harold's promises, whispered words in motel rooms. When the time is right, I'll leave it all. You and me, Evelyn. No more lies. But promises are dangerous currency, and Harold had a way of spending them freely. Cinematically, the image of Evelyn became part of the town's folklore. Children dared each other to ride their bikes past her house. Men lowered their voices when she walked into stores. Women looked at her with equal parts contempt and envy. In Coldwater, her mere existence was a scandal, but tied to Harold's disappearance, she became something far darker, a possible accomplice, or perhaps the reason he vanished at all. The investigation stalled again. Without Harold's body, without his car, all they had were ghosts, and Evelyn, wrapped in her red coat, refused to give them anything solid. But her silence was not the silence of innocence. It was the silence of someone holding a truth too dangerous to release. And as spring approached, one thing grew certain: the woman in red knew more than she was willing to admit. And in the void of Harold's absence, her story was just beginning to unravel. Memory is a fragile thing, but in Coldwater, 1978, Harold Whitmore's final weeks burned themselves into the lives of everyone around him. To Margaret, they were weeks of distance. Nights when Harold came home late, smelling faintly of smoke and perfume, the imprint of his body beside hers colder with every passing day. To Evelyn, they were weeks of stolen hours, of whispered promises in motel rooms, of fear that what they had could never stay hidden. And to Harold himself, they were weeks spent looking over his shoulder, sensing shadows that grew closer each night. At home, Margaret's patience frayed. She remembered one evening when Harold arrived near midnight, tossing his coat onto a chair, his face unreadable. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice tight. "Work," Harold muttered, loosening his tie. "Don't lie to me." For the first time, his eyes softened, almost guilty. But instead of answering, he poured himself a glass of whiskey, draining it in silence. That silence, heavier than words, sharper than arguments, became their marriage's final language. In contrast, Evelyn's memories painted a different Harold. At the Sunset Motel, with its peeling wallpaper and buzzing neon sign, he was tender, almost desperate. He would trace circles on her wrist with his thumb, whispering promises he never gave his wife. "It won't be much longer," Harold said one night, his voice low against the hum of the motel heater. "I'll walk away from all of it. The badge, the lies. You and me, Evelyn. We'll start over." Evelyn wanted to believe him. She wanted to see Harold not as the chief, not as the man feared by the town, but as the man who looked at her with hunger and longing. Still, doubt crept in. Each time he left, she feared it would be the last. Yet behind closed doors at the station, Harold's behavior turned darker. He was restless, his temper quick to ignite. Officers noticed him checking over his shoulder, rifling through files he'd ordered locked away months earlier. He muttered about corruption, about debts owed and favors promised. To some, it looked like paranoia. To others, it sounded like a man preparing for war. Deputy Raymond recalled a particularly late night. Harold had been pacing, cigarette in hand, eyes bloodshot. "You ever feel like the walls are listening, Ray?" Raymond frowned. "You need rest, Chief. You're burning out." Harold exhaled smoke, shaking his head. "No, something's coming. And if it does, I don't know who I can trust." Cinematically, those final weeks would play out like a film spliced with contradictions. Margaret was alone in their kitchen, her reflection fractured in the shards of a broken glass. Evelyn was waiting in the dim motel room, her red coat draped across the chair, the ticking clock marking every minute Harold was late. Harold himself, sitting in his office under a single lamp, files spread before him, the smoke from his cigarette curling like ghosts around his face. The weight of secrets pressed harder with each day. Margaret began following him once, her car creeping behind his. She stopped short when she saw where he turned, the motel off Highway 16. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel, her chest tightening as the red neon light flickered against her windshield. She drove home without confronting him, but the image never left her. Harold disappearing into a room with another woman. That night, Margaret lay awake, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. Resentment pooled inside her, sharp and bitter. Betrayal has a way of hardening into resolve, and hers was beginning to form. Harold didn't know it, but a storm of his own making surrounded him. A wife suffocating under betrayal. A mistress clinging to fragile hope. A deputy drowning in secrets. And a chief whose paranoia whispered that his time was running out. By the end of those weeks, Harold Whitmore would no longer just be a man with secrets. He would become the town's darkest question. And the answers buried deep would demand silence from those who knew the truth. In a police force, silence can be loyalty, or it can be complicity. In Coldwater, after Harold Whitmore vanished, that silence became a code. One Deputy Raymond Carter carried like a stone in his chest. Raymond had been Harold's shadow for nearly a decade. Where the chief went, he followed. When Harold barked orders, Raymond obeyed. But respect had long since curdled into something more complicated. Fear, dependence, and the unspoken knowledge that Harold knew things about him, things that could ruin him. The weeks after Harold's disappearance left Raymond torn. Officially, he led the search, combing fields, knocking on doors, questioning townsfolk who already knew the script. Unofficially, he burned documents, removed names from files, and kept certain truths from surfacing. Each time he struck a match, he felt the chief's presence in the smoke, as if Harold still commanded him from beyond the grave. One night, alone in the station, Raymond pulled a stack of papers from a locked drawer, reports of unexplained cash movements, complaints against Harold, names of men who had reason to hate him. He read them in silence, sweat dripping down his temple. Then, with trembling hands, he fed them into the furnace in the basement. "Forgive me, Chief," he whispered, watching the flames devour the words. "This is what loyalty looks like, but loyalty came at a cost." Other officers began asking questions. Sergeant Miller, younger and ambitious, pressed him one afternoon. "Why shut down leads, Ray? Every road we take, you close it off. What are you hiding?" Raymond's jaw tightened. "Watch your tone, Sergeant. You think you know what's best? You didn't serve under him like I did." "No," Miller shot back. "And maybe that's a good thing." The words lingered like gunpowder in the air. Outside the station, the town speculated freely. But inside the department, speculation was dangerous. Men lowered their voices when Harold's name came up, eyes flicking to Raymond before they spoke. They knew he was hiding something, they just didn't know what. Cinematically, the image was stark. Officers gathered in the locker room, shadows stretching long across the concrete floor, voices muffled under the hum of fluorescent lights. Raymond was sitting apart, his hands clasped, his face drawn. A man guarding not only Harold's secrets, but his own. At home, the silence grew heavier. Raymond's wife noticed his distant stares, the way he lingered on the porch with a cigarette long after everyone else was asleep. One night she asked him plainly, "Ray, did Harold do something? Something you can't say?" He looked at her, eyes hollow. "The less you know, the safer you are." Her fear grew. His silence became her prison. The breaking point came 2 months after Harold's disappearance. A late-night knock rattled Raymond's door. Evelyn stood there, her red coat soaked from the rain, her mascara streaked down her cheeks. She looked less like the town's seductress and more like a woman crumbling. "He promised me, Ray," she said, voice shaking. "He promised we'd leave. Now he's gone and they all think I—" "Stop." Raymond's voice was sharp, desperate. He pulled her inside, shutting the door. "You don't say another word about this. To anyone, do you understand?" She stared at him, trembling. "You know something. You know where he went?" Raymond turned away, jaw clenched. "All you need to know is that silence keeps us alive." The bond of the badge had always demanded loyalty. But now it demanded lies, destruction of evidence, the suffocation of truth. Raymond told himself it was for Harold, for the man who had led him. But in the dark, when the house was quiet and the only sound was his own breathing, another thought crept in. Maybe it wasn't loyalty at all. Maybe it was fear. And as the spring of 1979 turned the fields green again, Silence settled deeper into Coldwater's police force. A silence so thick it buried the truth along with Harold Whitmore, until, decades later, the earth itself would give up what men tried so hard to keep hidden. 40 years is a long time to keep a secret buried. Long enough for a town to grow comfortable with silence, for guilt to calcify into habit. But the earth has a way of speaking when people refuse to. Coldwater, summer of 2018. A construction crew broke ground on the edge of town where an abandoned lot was being cleared for a new shopping center. The machines churned through layers of dirt and concrete until one operator's blade struck metal with a hollow clang. At first they thought it was scrap. Old farm equipment, maybe. But as the soil crumbled away, a different shape emerged. A roof, a door, the faint outline of a police light bar. The bulldozer halted. Men stepped back, their voices hushed. What they uncovered was no relic of farmland. It was a police cruiser, rusted, crushed by decades of earth pressing down. The news spread like fire. Within hours, the site was cordoned off. Detectives arrived, their gloves snapping on as cameras clicked in the humid air. The sight of that sunken vehicle was cinematic. Dirt piled high around the twisted metal, vines creeping across what had once been black and white paint. The number 12 barely visible on the door. Deputy Raymond, now retired and gray, watched the scene from behind the yellow tape. His hands shook as the wrecker lifted the car from its grave. He whispered to himself, "God help us." Inside the car, investigators found relics of another time. Harold's badge, tarnished but unmistakable, lay wedged between the seats. His revolver, rusted and corroded, rested in its holster. Fragments of cloth clung to the floor, stained dark. Blood, or what was left of it after 4 decades underground. The most haunting discovery was the driver's side door. It had been locked from the outside. This wasn't abandonment, one detective muttered. This was a burial. The town reacted with a mix of shock and dread. Headlines blared, Coldwater Chief's car found after 40 years. For those who remembered 1978, old wounds split open. Margaret, frail now and living alone, turned on her television to see her husband's name plastered across the screen once more. Her glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor. She stared blankly, whispering, "No, not again." Evelyn, with gray streaks in her once dark hair, sat in the corner of a nursing home, the news playing faintly from a TV down the hall. Her lips trembled as she closed her eyes, whispering Harold's name like a prayer, like a curse. Detectives combed the car for every scrap of evidence. Cinematically, the process unfolded under harsh floodlights, gloves sifting through dust, flash cameras popping against the corroded steel, every detail catalogued with sterile precision. Yet beneath the science lingered the human truth. This was not just a vehicle. It was a coffin, and the coffin did not just hold Harold's belongings. It held 4 decades of lies, rumors, and betrayal, all pressing upward into the present. Deputy Raymond sat in his kitchen that night, staring at a glass of whiskey that had gone untouched. His wife asked what was wrong, but he didn't answer. He could still see the badge in his mind, still hear Harold's voice calling him brother. The weight of silence he had carried for years was becoming unbearable. He muttered to himself, barely audible, "They've found him. They've finally found him." The discovery of the car was not the end. It was a beginning. A door forced open by the earth itself, demanding the truth be told. And in the weeks that followed, Coldwater would realize something chilling. Harold Whitmore had not simply vanished. He had been put underground, and those responsible were still alive to feel the walls closing in. The buried car was only the spark. The real fire began when Coldwater realized someone would need to confront the truth they'd spent 40 years avoiding. That someone was Detective Laura Kane. Laura wasn't from Coldwater. She was assigned from the state's cold case division, a specialist in crimes that never slept. Tall, sharp-eyed, with a history of her own ghosts, she had learned to carry silence like armor. But when she arrived in the small town, she immediately felt the tension, like a room gone still when a stranger walks in. The diner went quiet when she stepped through its door for lunch on her first day. Conversations dropped mid-sentence. Spoons clinked nervously against coffee cups. Everyone knew why she was here. Everyone knew what had been dug up. At the police station, the files on Harold Whitmore's disappearance were stacked high on her desk. Yellowed pages with coffee stains, handwritten notes smudged with time. She flipped through them slowly, her eyes narrowing. Missing person reports, statements from Harold's wife, Margaret, testimonies from deputies, whispers of corruption, though carefully redacted. The official narrative had been simple. Harold Whitmore vanished without a trace, but nothing about the buried car was simple. She traced her finger over a line from the original investigation. Last seen leaving the station at 11:43 p.m. Then she thought of the car, locked from the outside, buried deep beneath soil no ordinary accident could explain. Laura leaned back, whispering to herself, someone put him there. Someone close. Her first visit was to Margaret Whitmore. The old woman's house was dim, curtains drawn, the air heavy with decades of loss. Margaret's eyes were tired, but still sharp enough to recognize a truth when it stood on her doorstep. Laura introduced herself gently. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm here about your husband." Margaret laughed bitterly, a sound like glass breaking. After 40 years, the state finally remembers Harold? "And what detective do you think you'll find that they didn't back then?" Laura sat across from her, notebook in hand. "I think the earth just gave us the truth, and I think someone in this town helped bury it." Margaret's hand trembled as she set down her tea. Her voice softened. "You don't know Harold, detective. He was complicated. Respected, yes, but he made enemies. He broke hearts. And some wounds never heal." Laura studied her. The grief was real, but so was the bitterness. Margaret wasn't protecting Harold's memory. She was protecting herself. That evening, Laura walked the streets of Coldwater, taking in its faded storefronts and peeling signs. A place frozen in time where everyone knew everyone and secrets lingered in the silence between hellos. She stopped outside the old station, boarded up now, and imagined Harold stepping out that final night in 1978. She could almost see him. Tall, stern, shoulders hunched with the weight of power and guilt. A man carrying something he couldn't put down. Her instincts whispered, this wasn't random. Someone loved him. Someone hated him. Someone decided both feelings were too heavy to bear. Later, at her motel, Laura spread the photos of the unearthed car across the bed. The rusted shell, the badge, the revolver. She traced the outlines with her pen, connecting them to names in the case file. Raymond, Evelyn, Margaret. Each thread circled back to Harold's private life, not his public duties. The case was less about a missing police chief and more about the shadows he left behind in people's hearts. The next morning, Laura met with Deputy Raymond. His hands shook as he lit a cigarette outside his porch, refusing to meet her eyes. She asked simple questions, but every answer dripped with hesitation. Finally, he muttered, "Detective, some things are better left buried. You dig too deep here, you'll find more than you came for." Laura stared at him. Maybe that's exactly what I came for. Coldwater had lived 40 years in silence. But with Laura Kane's arrival, silence was no longer an option. The ghosts of the past were awake now, and they weren't going back underground. Detective Laura Kane had learned to follow the silences as much as the words. In Coldwater, the silences were deafening. Every file she read, every cautious answer she received, it all pointed not toward Harold's public role as chief, but toward his private life. One name appeared repeatedly in whispers, in hesitant lines scrawled in reports that never made it to court. Evelyn Carter. Evelyn had been a secretary at the town hall in 1978, 29 years old, unmarried, and known for her sharp wit and striking beauty. But in Coldwater, beauty was often a curse. Harold's name was tied to hers in murmurs never proven, just enough for the town to pretend they didn't see what was happening. Laura began with records. Invoices, shift logs, Harold's handwritten notes. She noticed a pattern, late-night hours that didn't align with his official duties, unexplained calls to Evelyn's office after everyone else had gone home. Small details invisible to those who hadn't been looking, but Laura was trained to see what others ignored. The next step was personal. Evelyn was still alive, living in a nursing facility on the far edge of town. Age had slowed her but not dimmed her eyes. When Laura introduced herself, Evelyn looked at her as though she had been waiting 40 years for this moment. "You've come about Harold," Evelyn said softly, before Laura even asked. Laura nodded. "I need to know the truth. Whatever it is." Evelyn's lips trembled as she reached for the silver locket around her neck, fingers lingering over it. Inside, Laura caught a glimpse of a faded photograph. Harold, smiling, not the stern man in the police portraits. A man at ease, unguarded. He loved me, Evelyn whispered. And I loved him. But in Coldwater, love like that was poison. The air in the room grew heavier. Evelyn spoke haltingly, like each word risked cracking open a wound she'd kept stitched shut for decades. Harold promised he would leave Margaret. Said he couldn't breathe in that house anymore. But a man like Harold, he couldn't just walk away. Too many eyes on him. Too much pride. Too much fear. Laura scribbled notes, but her mind raced faster than her pen. A forbidden affair explained the whispers, the hostility, even Margaret's bitterness. But it didn't explain the car buried underground. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. The night he disappeared, he called me, said he had something to tell me. Something that would change everything. But he never came. She gripped Laura's hand suddenly with surprising strength. Detective, you have to understand. People in this town wanted him gone. Not just because of me. Because Harold knew things. He carried everyone's secrets, and that made him dangerous. Outside the facility, Laura sat in her car, Evelyn's words echoing in her mind. Love like poison. Secrets like weapons. She flipped back to Harold's file, this time reading between the lines. Reports of internal disputes. Quiet accusations of money gone missing. Deputies who were loyal on the surface but restless underneath. Harold had not only betrayed his wife, he had betrayed the trust of his department. The affair wasn't the whole story, but it was the crack in the foundation, the weakness others could exploit. That evening, Laura walked past the town's church, its bell tower silhouetted against the dying light. She imagined Harold and Evelyn in stolen moments, whispered phone calls, secret meetings, promises made in the dark. Passion twisted with fear, both of them knowing discovery would mean ruin, and someone had discovered. Laura returned to her motel, spreading her notes across the bed once more. Harold's betrayal of Margaret, his affair with Evelyn, and his enemies in the department. The puzzle pieces were aligning. And yet the largest question remained unsolved. Who locked that car door? As she turned off the lamp, she caught her reflection in the mirror. For a moment she thought she saw Harold standing there, not the man in uniform, but the man in Evelyn's locket. Smiling, alive, as if daring her to keep pulling on threads that could unravel the entire town. Coldwater was no longer just a place with ghosts. It was a place where betrayal lingered like smoke, curling into every corner, waiting for someone brave enough, or foolish enough, to breathe it in. Detective Laura Kane had learned that lies rarely collapse all at once. They fracture, splintering under pressure until truth seeps through the cracks. Coldwater was beginning to splinter. The discovery of Harold's buried car had forced people to speak. Reluctantly, cautiously, but still, they spoke. Each word, each hesitation added weight to Laura's suspicions. She knew now that this wasn't only about Harold's affair. It was about the control he wielded, the grudges he carried, and the enemies he made in his own home and station. Laura returned to Margaret Whitmore's house. The old widow opened the door slowly, her frame frail but her eyes sharp with defiance. Detective, I already told you everything I know. Laura stepped inside without asking, her tone firm. You told me what you wanted on record. I need what you've buried. You knew about Evelyn Carter, didn't you? Margaret's hand twitched, gripping the arm of her chair. For a moment, silence, then a bitter laugh. Of course I knew. You think a wife doesn't notice when her husband comes home smelling like another woman's perfume? I knew, but Harold was mine. I wasn't going to let some secretary take him away. Laura studied her. The bitterness wasn't new. It was fossilized, hardened over decades. Did you confront him? Margaret's eyes gleamed. The night he disappeared, I begged him to stop. To choose his family. He walked out that door anyway. And that was the last I ever saw him. The words carried a tremor, grief mixed with fury. Laura caught it and stored it away. Margaret wasn't just mourning Harold. She had been at war with him until the end. Next came Deputy Raymond. Laura found him in his garage tinkering with an old pickup. The smell of oil and rust filled the air, masking the sour edge of his nerves. Detective, I already gave my statement. Laura leaned against the workbench, her voice calm but sharp. And yet, every time I ask about Harold, your answers come slower. Why is that, Deputy? Raymond's jaw tightened. Because dredging up the past doesn't do anyone good. Laura stepped closer, lowering her voice. Unless you're hiding something. unless Harold's disappearance wasn't just about Harold, but about everyone he held power over. The wrench in his hand slipped, clattering onto the concrete. For a long moment, he didn't move. Finally, he muttered, "You don't understand, detective. Harold wasn't the saint people painted him as. He kept things, evidence, leverage. He knew everyone's sins and used them when he wanted something. That kind of man. He makes enemies," Laura pressed. "Enemies like you?" Raymond's head snapped up, eyes burning with something between guilt and anger. But he didn't answer. Instead, he lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply as if the smoke could choke down the truth. That night, Laura reviewed both conversations in her motel room. Margaret's bitterness, Raymond's hesitation, both tied to Harold's double life, a man who preached order by day and manipulated shadows by night. She pinned their names on the board beside Evelyn's. 3 threads pulling in different directions, all tangled at the center, Harold Whitmore. But what chilled Laura most wasn't the affair or the grudges. It was the buried car, the locked door. Someone hadn't just wanted Harold gone, they wanted him silenced forever. The next morning, Laura returned to the construction site. The cruiser still sat under tarps, evidence technicians combing through its remains. She stared at it for a long time, the earth still raw and torn around the pit. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a monument, a warning. Her phone buzzed, a message from the lab. Trace samples on the driver's seatbelt showed DNA, degraded but testable. Her pulse quickened. If the past was cracking, the science of the present might shatter it wide open. The facade of Coldwater was breaking, and beneath it, Laura could already feel the rot waiting to surface. The deeper Laura dug, the heavier Coldwater felt. Every conversation was layered with something unsaid, every memory sharpened by guilt. The town wasn't just haunted by Harold's disappearance, it was built on it. Laura sat in her motel room, notes spread across the bed like a crime scene of paper and ink. Margaret's bitter confessions, Evelyn's trembling admissions, Raymond's cracks of guilt. Each told a piece of Harold's story, but none could stand alone. She pinned their names under Harold's photograph, circling each with red ink. At the center, she wrote one word: secrets. Harold Whitmore had been more than a police chief. He had been Coldwater's confessor, but not out of kindness. He collected sins like currency, deputies who drank on the job, business owners skimming profits, a preacher caught in affairs of his own. Harold had files, rumors said, hidden documents, photographs, tapes. Evelyn gave him love. Margaret gave him a family. Raymond gave him loyalty, or fear disguised as it. But Harold gave nothing freely. Everything was leverage. Laura whispered into the silence of the room. "You weren't just betrayed, Harold. You betrayed them all first." The next morning, she visited the archives at the courthouse. Dust coated the old ledgers, files brittle with time. She scoured Harold's handwriting, neat and deliberate. Patterns emerged. Notes about people, side comments slipped into reports that didn't belong. One entry stood out. A deputy was cited for misconduct. The note in Harold's hand read, "Keep this. May need it later." Laura's stomach turned. He hadn't been protecting his department. He'd been building a private arsenal of secrets. Back in town, whispers swirled like smoke. Old men at the bar stopped talking when Laura entered. Women at the market exchanged wary glances. Coldwater wasn't used to outsiders, and it wasn't used to questions, especially not questions about Harold Whitmore. That evening, Laura knocked on Raymond's door again. He opened it more slowly this time, eyes bloodshot, the smell of whiskey heavy in the air. She didn't waste words. "Harold was blackmailing you, wasn't he?" Raymond froze, his hands clenched at his sides. For a long time, he said nothing. Then in a low voice, "He had something on all of us, things that could ruin careers, families, lives. Harold made sure nobody could touch him. He thought he was untouchable." Laura's gaze hardened. "And that's why he ended up in the ground." Raymond's lips parted, but no words came. Just a flicker of something in his eyes. Confirmation without confession. The weight of Harold's secrets wasn't just his burden. It had become the town's. Each person who had lived in Coldwater carried a fragment of that night, whether in guilt, fear, or silence. As Laura drove back to her motel, she felt it pressing on her chest, a suffocating heaviness. The line between victim and perpetrator blurred. Harold had been betrayed, yes, but he had forged the blade himself by holding power through manipulation. That night, She dreamed of the car. The soil pressing down, the locked door, the silence of a man trapped in darkness. But in the dream, Harold wasn't pleading for help. He was smiling as if daring her to uncover what even death hadn't silenced. She woke in a cold sweat. The motel room was quiet. The paper still spread like broken glass across the bed. On the nightstand, her phone buzzed with a message from the lab. DNA confirmed. Partial match to a living resident of Coldwater. Laura sat up straight, her pulse hammering. The past had finally reached into the present, and Coldwater's secrets were no longer just history. They were alive, breathing, waiting to crush anyone who tried to drag them into the light. The DNA results cracked Coldwater wide open. After 40 years, the Earth had spoken, and now science had whispered a name. Laura sat at her desk in the small motel room, staring at the report glowing on her laptop screen. Partial DNA match Deputy Raymond Carter. Her throat tightened. Raymond, the loyal deputy, Harold's right hand. The man who had stood in silence while others speculated, who warned her to stop digging. His blood was in that car. His guilt was buried with Harold, Laura whispered to herself. All this time, you were carrying it. The next morning, she drove to Raymond's house. The dawn light cut across the road in long, sharp lines. The air smelled of wet soil from last night's storm. She parked in front of his modest home, her heart heavy, knowing this conversation could end one of two ways: confession or collapse. Raymond opened the door before she knocked, as if he had been waiting. His eyes were hollow, the lines of age etched deep across his face. He didn't invite her in, but she stepped inside anyway. The living room was cluttered with old photographs, fishing rods, and medals from his years in service. It looked like the life of a man who wanted to be remembered as good, but memory and truth rarely aligned. Laura sat across from him. Her voice was low but steady. The lab found your DNA in Harold's car. You were there when it happened. No more silence, Raymond. His hands trembled as he lit a cigarette. The first drag was long, desperate. Smoke curled between them, heavy as confession. I never meant for it to go that far, he whispered. Laura leaned forward. Tell me. His eyes glossed over as if he were staring back through decades. Harold wasn't just chief. He was king. He knew everything about us, about me, things I couldn't let my family find out. He kept it all locked away, and every time I thought I was free, he'd remind me. He owned me, detective. He swallowed hard, tears cutting down his weathered face. That night I confronted him, told him to stop. He laughed, said I'd never escape him, said he'd ruin me if I ever crossed him, and I snapped. The cigarette trembled between his fingers. I hit him. Harder than I meant to. He went down. The blood, it wouldn't stop. And when I saw him gasping, I knew there was no going back. Laura's voice was barely above a whisper. So you locked him in the car? Raymond nodded slowly. His lips quivered. I thought maybe it would look like he disappeared on his own. Maybe the town would just forget. I buried the car with my own hands. Every shovel of dirt felt like it was crushing me, but I couldn't stop. Laura's pen hovered above her notebook, but she didn't write. She just watched him, a man hollowed out by 4 decades of silence, guilt carved into every line of his face. You lived with this for 40 years, she said. Why not confess? Why not free yourself? Raymond's eyes lifted, blazing suddenly with something between anger and despair. Because the truth doesn't free anyone here, detective. It burns everything. Margaret knew Harold was cheating. Evelyn knew he would never leave her. I knew what he was doing with the department. If the truth came out, it wouldn't just be me ruined. It would be all of us. Coldwater needed its silence. The room went still. Laura felt the weight of his words pressing into her chest. This wasn't just one man's crime. It was a pact of silence, a collective sin. Raymond had only been the hand. The town itself had been the accomplice. She closed her notebook, her voice calm but cutting. The silence ends now. Raymond looked at her with hollow eyes, a broken smile flickering. Then I guess I won't be here to see it. Before she could move, he reached into the drawer beside his chair. Laura froze, her training kicking in, but Raymond didn't aim at her. He turned the revolver toward himself. Her voice cracked. Raymond, don't. A single shot split the air. Smoke. Silence. The end of a man who had carried too much for too long. Laura sat in the aftermath, heart pounding, ears ringing. Raymond lay slumped in his chair. a trail of smoke rising from the revolver. The truth had surfaced, but it came coated in blood and ash. She knew this was not the final chapter. There were still pieces missing. Evelyn, Margaret, the secrets Harold left behind. Coldwater's story wasn't over. It was only reaching its cruelest point. The courtroom was colder than the winter outside. Eleanor sat in the front row, her hands trembling as the judge read the final verdict. Decades of silence had collapsed into this single moment. The truth had clawed its way out from beneath the earth just as Harold's car had. But the cost of revelation was written in every face present. The evidence was damning. Financial records hidden in drawers, tapes of conversations once thought destroyed, and the grim testimony of those who had carried guilt for 40 years. The betrayal had not been Harold's alone. It was a web of corruption, forbidden love, secret pacts, threads that had strangled the town for decades. Detective Sullivan stood at the back, his jaw tight. He had carried the case farther than anyone had dared, and now that justice was served, he felt no triumph, only exhaustion, the heavy emptiness of knowing that truth once uncovered could never heal what time had already broken. Eleanor turned her head, eyes landing on Sullivan. For a fleeting moment, their gazes locked, shared grief, shared burden. She had lost a husband, though she had hated him in his final days. Sullivan had lost illusions, the fragile belief that justice could ever be clean. In the hush of the courtroom, the gavel struck, final and sharp. The case was closed. Harold Whitmore's name was written in the records, not as a hero, not as a victim, but as both betrayer and betrayed. A man who had carried secrets to his grave, until the ground itself gave them back. Later that night, Sullivan drove alone down the quiet back roads where Harold had vanished in 1978. The fields stretched endlessly, shadows folding over one another. He pulled over near the ridge where the car had been unearthed, now cordoned off with tape. The soil was scarred, raw, as if the earth itself had been wounded by what it was forced to reveal. He stepped out, the cold biting through his coat. The silence here was deeper than any courtroom, heavier than any confession. And as the wind moved through the grass, Sullivan understood. Some crimes never end. They linger, haunting those who survived, reshaping those who remember. The town would heal, perhaps. People would move on, whisper less, rebuild. But beneath the surface, beneath every smile, every handshake, lay the reminder of what had been buried. That the powerful could fall. That betrayal could outlive love. That truth, no matter how long suppressed, always claws its way back. Sullivan lit a cigarette, the ember glowing faintly in the dark. He exhaled, watching the smoke disappear into the night. Then he whispered, not to Harold, not to Eleanor, not even to himself, but to the silence that had watched it all. It's never really over. The wind carried his words away, as if the night itself refused to hold them, and with that, the story of Harold Whitmore, the police chief who vanished in 1978, the man whose secrets surfaced 40 years later, settled back into the soil of the town, not gone, not forgotten, just buried deeper in memory than even the earth could hold.